Most people spend their day reacting to things they never chose. A message comes in and the mood shifts. A delay happens and the whole plan falls apart. Someone says one careless thing and it replays in the mind for hours. None of this is unusual. It is simply how an untrained mind works, moving from one outside event to the next, always slightly behind, always slightly on edge. The Stoics noticed this pattern over 2,000 years ago and built a way of living around one plain fact. The outside world will never slow down or behave for you, but the mind can be trained to stop being pulled around by it. That is what this video is actually about. Before we go further, if this channel is helping you build a calmer, steadier mind, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It helps this channel keep making these lessons. It puts more of them in front of the people who need them. Number 1. Separate what is yours from what isn't. Every form of unnecessary suffering can be traced back to one mistake: treating something outside your control as if it were inside your control. This is the starting point of Stoic philosophy, and it is not a mood or a mindset trick. It is a practical filing system for your attention. The moment you catch yourself trying to control the weather, another person's opinion, the outcome of a job interview, or how fast a queue moves, you're spending energy on a battle that was lost before it began. The Stoics called this confusion the root of almost all human distress, because the mind keeps trying to grip things that were never designed to be gripped. Learning to notice this in real time, as it happens, is the first skill worth building. Epictetus, a man who was born into slavery and later became one of the most respected teachers in Rome, built his entire teaching around a single division. Some things are up to us, and some things are not. Our judgments, our choices, our effort, and our reactions are up to us. Other people's actions, the past, the economy, illness, and the general chaos of the world are not. He did not teach this as a comforting idea. He taught it as a fact of life, the way gravity is a fact of life. You do not get angry at gravity for existing. In the same way, there is no logical reason to exhaust yourself being angry at things that were never under your authority to begin with. This distinction sounds simple when you hear it, but almost nobody applies it consistently, because modern life is built to blur the line. Advertisements suggest you can control how people see you if you buy the right product. Social media suggests you can control your reputation if you manage it carefully enough. News cycles suggest that staying anxious and informed is a form of control. All of this is an illusion, and the constant chasing of that illusion is exactly what produces the tired, wired, low-grade anxiety so many people carry through an ordinary day. Chaos outside becomes chaos inside only when we forget where the boundary actually sits. Consider a normal example. A person is stuck in traffic and is going to be late for an important meeting. The traffic itself is completely outside their control. No amount of frustration will move the cars. What is within their control is how they use the delay. They can call ahead, they can prepare mentally for the meeting, they can breathe evenly instead of gripping the wheel, or they can spend the entire time in a state of low-level rage that accomplishes nothing except raising their heart rate and ruining the mood they walk into the meeting with. The traffic is identical either way. The only variable is which part of the situation the person chose to fight. This same filter applies to relationships, health, and career. You cannot control whether someone likes you, but you can control whether you are honest and fair with them. You cannot control whether a job offer comes through, but you can control how well you prepared and how you present yourself. You cannot control a diagnosis, but you can control how consistently you follow good habits and good medical advice. Every situation, no matter how chaotic it looks from the outside, has an inner core that remains entirely yours. Finding that inner core again and again is the daily practice. The peace that Stoicism offers is not the peace of a world that has calmed down. The world rarely calms down for long. It is the peace of a mind that has stopped assigning itself jobs it was never equipped to do. Once you stop trying to control the traffic, the opinions, the outcomes, and the noise, an enormous amount of nervous energy becomes available again. Energy you can now spend on the only place it was ever useful: your own judgments, your own choices, and your own next action. Number 2, the difference between the event and your reaction. A core Stoic idea, one repeated by nearly every major Stoic writer, is that people are not disturbed by events themselves, but by the opinions they form about those events. This is not a claim that bad things don't happen or that pain isn't real. It is a much more precise observation. The raw event and your emotional response to it are two separate steps, and there is a gap between them where judgment happens. Most people never notice this gap because it closes in a fraction of a second. Learning to notice it and eventually to widen it is one of the most useful skills a person can develop for a chaotic life. Take a simple, common scenario. A colleague sends a short, blunt email. On one day, in a good mood, you barely register it. You read it, reply, and move on. On another day, tired and stressed, the same email feels cold, even hostile, and it bothers you for an hour. The email did not change. The words on the screen were identical both times. What changed was the judgment layered on top of it. The interpretation your mind added about what the tone meant, what it said about you, or what might happen next. The event was neutral. The suffering came entirely from the story attached to it. Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor who wrote his private notebook not for an audience, but for himself, returned to this idea constantly, especially during years of war, plague, and political betrayal. He reminded himself, over and over, that the disturbance he felt was never coming directly from the outside world. It was coming from his own internal reaction to it, which he had the power to examine and correct. This was not abstract comfort for him. He was running an empire during one of its most difficult stretches, surrounded by real threats, real loss, and real pressure. And this single distinction was one of the tools that kept him functional and clear-headed through it. This gap between event and reaction is where all Stoic practice actually lives. It is not about suppressing emotion or pretending to feel nothing. The Stoics were explicit that grief, concern, and even anger are natural first reactions that arise before thought has time to catch up. The goal is not to block that first spark, but to prevent it from being fed and amplified by an unexamined story. When you feel a surge of anger, the Stoic move is not to deny the anger, but to pause before deciding it is justified, before deciding what it means, and before deciding what action it demands. That pause is the entire skill. In modern daily life, this gap is under constant attack. Notifications are designed to trigger a reaction before you have time to think. Headlines are written to provoke an emotional response in the first 3 words. Arguments online are structured so that a reply feels urgent, immediate, almost involuntary. None of this is an accident, and none of it is your fault, but it does mean the gap between event and reaction has to be rebuilt on purpose, because the environment will not build it for you. A short pause, even 3 seconds, before replying, reacting, or deciding something is true, restores a piece of control that modern design tries to take away. Widening this gap does not happen overnight, and it does not happen through willpower alone. It happens through repetition, noticing the moment of irritation, naming it quietly to yourself, and choosing the next thought instead of letting the first one run the show. Over months, this becomes less like a discipline and more like a natural pause built into your character. That pause is where peace actually lives, not in a world with fewer problems, but in a mind that no longer mistakes the first reaction for the only possible one. Number 3, building an inner stability the world cannot touch. The Stoics used a specific image for this idea: an inner citadel, a fortified place inside a person that outside events cannot reach unless that person opens the gate themselves. This was never meant as decoration. It describes something very concrete, a stable core of judgment and character that does not shift just because circumstances shift. Most people build their sense of stability on things that move constantly. Their job situation, other people's moods, the state of their finances, the news of the day. Because these things move, the person's inner state moves with them, and that constant movement is experienced as chaos, even when nothing catastrophic is actually happening. Seneca, a Roman statesman who lived through exile, the loss of his position, and the constant danger of being close to an unstable emperor, wrote extensively about where a person should actually locate their sense of security. His conclusion, tested through real personal loss rather than theory, was that anything you cannot lose is the only thing worth building your foundation on. Wealth can be taken, position can be taken, even health and life itself can be taken. But your judgment, your integrity, your discipline, and your character remain entirely under your own authority until the moment you choose to surrender them. Building your stability there, rather than on shifting external things, is what makes a person hard to shake. This does not mean external things don't matter. The Stoics are not against having a good job, good relationships, comfort, or success. They simply refuse to place their sense of self entirely inside those things, because anything placed there becomes a hostage to circumstances outside your control. A person whose entire identity depends on their job title will be shattered by a layoff in a way that a person who values their own diligence, honesty, and skill will not be, even though both people lost the same job. The external loss is identical. The internal devastation is not, because one person's foundation moved with the loss and the other person's did not. Building this kind of internal stability is not a one-time decision. It is closer to physical training, built through repeated small tests rather than a single dramatic moment. Each time you face a minor setback and choose a steady, reasoned response instead of a chaotic one, you are laying another brick in that inner structure. Each time you let a small frustration hijack your mood for hours, you are letting the foundation stay soft. Over years, these small choices compound into either a person who bends and cracks under ordinary pressure or a person who remains level-headed while everyone around them is not. The difference is rarely dramatic in any single moment. It becomes visible only in hindsight. A useful daily practice for this is a short evening review, something Seneca specifically recommended to himself. At the end of the day, briefly ask what went well, what went poorly, and what could be handled better tomorrow, without harsh self-judgment and without excuse-making. This is not about guilt. It is closer to a coach reviewing game footage, honest, specific, and aimed at improvement rather than punishment. Done consistently, this small review becomes one of the bricks in the inner citadel, because it trains the mind to look at its own conduct clearly rather than drifting through days without any real self-observation. The result of this steady internal work is a person who can walk into genuinely difficult circumstances, a health scare, a financial setback, a public failure, without being emotionally leveled by them. This is not because the person feels nothing. It is because the foundation of their sense of self was never resting on those external conditions in the first place. That is what real, durable peace looks like. Not the absence of hard days, but a place inside a person that hard days cannot reach. Number 4, practicing for chaos before it arrives. One of the more counterintuitive Stoic habits is deliberately imagining difficulty before it happens. A practice sometimes called negative visualization. This is not pessimism, and it is not the same as anxious worrying, which spirals without direction and produces only tension. It is a structured, brief mental exercise, picturing the loss of something you value, health, a relationship, a job, a comfort. Not to dread it, but to remove the shock and entitlement that usually make real loss so much harder to bear when it eventually arrives. The Stoics believe that most people are blindsided by hardship, not because hardship is rare, but because they never once considered it possible. Seneca specifically recommended thinking through worst-case outcomes before major decisions or journeys. Not to become fearful, but to arrive at the calm realization that even the worst outcome is something a person can survive and respond to. This exercise strips an event of its power to shock you. A person who has never once considered the possibility of losing their job experiences a layoff as a catastrophe that shatters their sense of reality. A person who has occasionally, briefly, and calmly considered that possibility experiences the same layoff as a hard day that requires a plan, painful, but not disorienting. The event is the same. The preparation changed everything about how it landed. This practice also quietly restores gratitude, which sounds like an unrelated benefit, but is deeply connected. When you briefly imagine not having your health, your home, your relationships, or your daily routine, the ordinary version of your life that you normally take for granted becomes visible again. Most people stop noticing the good things in their life, simply because those things have been present for a long time. Chaos often feels heavier than it should because the mind is busy noticing everything wrong and has stopped noticing the long list of things that are still, in fact, fine. A short daily practice of noticing what could be lost restores some of that visibility. Marcus Aurelius used a related version of this practice, reminding himself each morning that the day ahead would likely include difficult people, frustrating delays, and unfair situations, and that this was simply the ordinary texture of being alive among other people. He did this not to feel gloomy about the day, but to remove his own surprise and outrage in advance, so that when a difficult colleague or an unfair decision actually appeared, it landed as something expected rather than something offensive. Surprise adds a second layer of suffering on top of any hardship. The shock of this shouldn't be happening stacked on top of the hardship itself. Preconsidering difficulty removes that second layer entirely. This kind of mental preparation is especially useful for the ordinary chaos of daily modern life. Traffic, rude strangers, unreliable technology, sudden changes in plans. None of these things are rare or unusual. Yet most people react to each one as though it is a personal insult from the universe. A person who has briefly, calmly accepted in advance that plans often change, that people are often difficult, and that things often break at inconvenient times, meets these moments with a kind of quiet readiness instead of outrage. This is not resignation or low expectations. It is realism. And realism is a far sturdier foundation for peace than optimism that keeps getting disappointed. The practice takes only a few minutes and can be done in the morning, before a difficult meeting, or before any event with an uncertain outcome. Briefly consider what could go wrong, accept that you could handle if it did, and then proceed with your plan as normal. This small habit, repeated regularly, quietly removes a huge portion of the emotional volatility that chaos usually produces, because so much of that volatility comes not from the difficulty itself, but from never having considered it possible in the first place. Number 5. Acting well regardless of the outcome. A common misunderstanding of Stoicism is that it teaches people not to care about results. This is inaccurate. The Stoics cared a great deal about outcomes and worked hard toward good ones. What they refused to do was tie their peace of mind directly to whether those outcomes actually happened, because outcomes depend on far more than one person's effort. They depend on other people, timing, luck, and countless factors outside anyone's control. Their solution was to place full effort and full attention on the action itself, while holding the result with a much looser, more open hand. This idea is sometimes described as the difference between the target and the arrow. An archer trains extensively, studies the wind, and releases the arrow with total focus and skill. Once the arrow leaves the bow, a gust of wind can still push it off course, no matter how well the shot was made. A Stoic archer takes full responsibility for the aim, the form, and the release, the parts genuinely within their control, but does not consider the shot a personal failure if the wind interferes with something beyond their control. This is not an excuse for sloppy effort. It is the opposite. It demands total effort exactly where effort matters, while releasing the anxious grip on parts that were never within reach. This distinction matters enormously in a chaotic world, because chaos is largely a symptom of trying to control outcomes directly instead of controlling effort and preparation. A student who ties their sense of self entirely to a specific grade will feel devastated by a result influenced by an unfair question, a bad night's sleep, or an unusually difficult exam that year, factors that had nothing to do with how well they actually studied. A student who ties their sense of self to how thoroughly they prepared will feel a very different kind of disappointment if the grade is lower than hoped. Real, but proportionate, and without the added collapse of feeling like a failure as a person. This principle applies directly to work and career. A person can write an excellent proposal, prepare a strong pitch, and interview well, and still not get the job or the client because the decision depended on internal politics, budget changes, or a competing candidate with one detail that happened to fit better. If a person's peace of mind depends entirely on winning, every uncontrollable loss becomes a personal wound. If a person's peace of mind depends on having prepared and performed with integrity, a loss becomes information and feedback rather than proof of inadequacy. The work was still good. The outcome was simply one variable among many, and it was never fully theirs to guarantee. This does not mean lowering standards or caring less about doing things well. In fact, it usually raises the quality of the effort because energy that used to go into anxious fixation on the outcome is now free to go into the actual preparation. A surgeon focused entirely on doing the procedure correctly, moment by moment, performs better than a surgeon distracted by anxious thoughts about whether the outcome will be perfect. The chaos of an uncertain result becomes much easier to sit with once a person has confirmed, honestly, that their own effort and conduct were sound. Living this way daily means asking a different question before and after any important effort. Instead of asking, did I get the result I wanted, the more useful question is, did I do this well, with the attention and integrity available to me? The first question hands your peace of mind to forces outside your control. The second keeps it exactly where it belongs, in your own hands, regardless of how the arrow eventually lands. Number 6, returning to the present moment again and again. Almost all chaos, once examined closely, is either chaos about the past or chaos about the future. A person replaying an old conversation is not dealing with the present moment at all. They are reliving something that has already ended and cannot be changed. A person anxious about tomorrow's meeting, next month's finances, or an uncertain diagnosis is not responding to a present danger. They're rehearsing something that has not happened yet and may never happen the way they imagine. The Stoics repeatedly pointed out that the present moment, examined honestly, is almost always more manageable than the mind's version of the past or the future. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself that a person can lose only the present moment, since that is the only thing anyone actually has, not the past, which is already gone, and not the future, which has not arrived. This was not a poetic observation for him, but a practical one, meant to redirect his attention away from imagined disasters and unchangeable regrets and back toward the single task directly in front of him. When the present task is handled with full attention, the mind has far less room left over for anxious wandering, because attention is a limited resource and cannot fully occupy two places at once. This principle explains why chaos often feels worse in the mind than it turns out to be in reality. A person imagining a difficult conversation days in advance runs through dozens of possible bad outcomes, most of which never occur, and suffers through each imagined version as if it were real. By the time the actual conversation happens, the person has often already endured far more suffering in anticipation than the real event ever produced. The Stoic response is not to stop planning or preparing. Planning is useful and within your control, but to notice the difference between useful preparation and repetitive, anxious rehearsal that changes nothing except your current mood. A simple, testable way to apply this is to ask, in any anxious moment, what specifically is wrong right now, in this exact minute. Not this week, not tomorrow, not in general, but in this precise moment. Very often, in this exact minute, a person is safe, fed, breathing normally, and not in any immediate danger, even while their mind insists that something is deeply wrong. This question does not erase real problems or make them disappear. It simply separates the real, current situation from a much larger, much scarier mental construction the mind has built on top of it, which usually includes the past, the future, and a dozen imagined possibilities all mixed together. This present focus is also where Stoic action actually happens, because you cannot act in the past, and you cannot act in a future that has not arrived yet. You can only ever act now. A person overwhelmed by a large, chaotic problem, a mountain of debt, a health crisis, a major life change, often freezes because they're trying to solve the entire timeline at once, including parts that have not happened yet. Returning to the present moment means asking only what the next right action is, right now, today, and doing that one thing well, rather than trying to mentally resolve a future that will unfold one day at a time regardless of how much it is worried about in advance. Practice consistently. This return to the present becomes less like a special technique and more like a resting state a person can return to throughout an ordinary day, while working, while talking with someone, while facing a hard decision. The world outside will likely remain just as unpredictable and chaotic as it has always been. What changes is where a person's attention actually lives. A mind anchored in the present moment, doing the next right thing with full attention, experiences far less of that outside chaos as personal suffering. Not because the chaos disappeared, but because the mind finally stopped meeting it halfway. If this video gave you something worth sitting with, consider subscribing for more practical Stoic lessons like this one, and share it with someone who could use a calmer mind this week.